lecture on blockchain and digital voting. So this is actually really kind of interesting. This is going to be a two-part lecture, so you might as well sit back and pop some popcorn on this one. There's a lot here, there's a lot to unpack, and there's a lot to address when it comes to using blockchain and digital voting, and just digital voting in general. So essentially what we've got here is that voting, we've always had issues with voter fraud. Always been a great concern. It's a thing that we do. And the idea behind this is you can make your vote truly count by using the nature of the blockchain. It will make voting transparent, and any changes made to the network will be noticed by the regulators. So basically, the idea behind this token-based system is using blockchain will ensure the system of one unchangeable vote per person. However, there's a lot of things that go along with that. So we're going to kind of break this up into two chunks here. We're going to break this up into the upside and the downside. But right now you're watching the upside of this, right? So it's kind of a mixed bag technology. It solves some problems, but it creates a host of other problems that haven't been solved yet. And the technology is still in its infancy, but it has been successfully used to help military members vote. So interesting. And then we also have doom or savior, right? Depending on where you go, blockchain is either going to be a direct threat to democracy or something that will be its savior. So it either has an upside or a downside to this. So we really need to move past the hype of this whole process and really take a look at how the technology works and why it works the way it works. So beyond the hype, right? It's an active technology right now with people working on it, and they are really being diligent in what they're trying to do. Mostly right now, the experiments are with low risk voting, things that are small votes, things like union voting or voting on contracts or other things to kind of work out the bugs. There's been some larger voting with military people who are stationed overseas who are using this to vote in stateside elections or national elections. So there's some active companies or researchers out there looking at this technology. There's some demo test beds and everything else. And it's not just for presidential or national level elections. People are using this everywhere to try to figure out the bugs. And that's actually a good thing. You would use it in a low risk environment first before you go on to the national level. So we want to do a quick history of voting in the United States. There are things that we're arguing about now with using blockchain and voting that have been with us since forever. All right, so you got to go back all the way to the George Washington's day where voting was a reason to binge, right? And it was like the candidate who served the most hooch often won. And that is God's own truth. Back in the day, you really did have people that were able to buy votes or coerce or influence votes, and sometimes by as little as booze, sometimes money, sometimes I'm going to threaten your family. We have a history of this whole process all the way through Chicago and New York, Tammany Square, all of it. It's all there. Boss hog. We got it. We're there, right? The U.S. Constitution does not guarantee the right to a secret ballot. And that's the very other thing that we need to know. The secret ballot is only a recent invention. The first 100 years of our nation, it was a very public matter. And it's been a very public matter in general for voting for a super long time. So contemporary participants in political party caucuses, voters were required to voice their electoral choices or go into a specifically colored booth or throw in a specifically colored rock and everyone could see the color of the rock you picked up. So there it is. And the other thing that we really need to face, and the fact on this one, is that voting is not private now because there are digital databases, commonly known as voter files, that are built by commercial organizations using official, publicly available government records of who is registered to vote and who cast ballots in past elections. Now, that doesn't mean it can show how I voted, but based on that paper trail, those actual voter records are part of research, so people can actually see how I voted. Right, so it's really not all that private. In fact, I've had my identity stolen through two of these research organizations, both at the University of Washington, because they were actually digging through the voter files and matching how I voted, along with the rest of the state of Washington, about where did we vote the way we did, or what was the election outcome, or what was the rest of it. These audit paper trails actually tie back to a specific individual and how they voted. And you can see that with all the audits that have gone on after the 2020 election, and that they were actually literally going through and trying to find out the dead body, trying to see if this person actually voted. They actually went back to find that individual voter to make sure that they voted the way that they actually did on the paper ballot. So with that out of the way, understanding that we have a history of weird election airing, we have a bunch of other things that go along on this one. I want you to do a quick Google search that can bring up voting information for anyone in the USA. If you're curious about what political party your boyfriend, girlfriend, or other is interested in, look up their voting record. It's really simple. Every state just about has these things online. The other thing that's interesting too is that this data is really subject to manipulation because there is nothing, I mean, literally nothing stopping anyone from pulling up a competing data system and altering it. So we've seen that in this era that people are willing to go to great lengths to present false information in election cycles. The 2020 election has, on one side, people are saying it's the most secure election. In the meantime, we're getting false slates of electors thrown up. So interesting. And the fact that our vote really doesn't elect a president is another issue. But, you know, we can have people alter data and there's no real way to check on that one. So the idea on this one is that if the blockchain voting system comes into play, everything can be authenticated step by step. The voting record becomes immutable and ideally open to everybody. But we're going to have some serious trust issues here. So with that in mind, the technology is still in progress. So while not necessarily a hot technology, it is being actively worked on. The concerns are outweighing the benefits of the technology, though. So the U.S. in history and in general has a lot of challenges when it comes to collecting and counting votes that the blockchain may be able to solve, especially things like long lines at the polls, to ensuring citizens are registered and motivated to vote, to questions surrounding whether a Chad was left hanging during the 2000 presidential election. The 2020 presidential election has got its own set of concerns that are outside of blockchain technology, right? Technology would not have solved the problem of a candidate refusing to concede the vote, right? It's just simple. Wouldn't have done it. And if the candidate did not trust the data that was coming in off the voting system, that is also outside of blockchain's reality. That's not anything that they would be worried about. So there's a lot of other concerns, some of them social, some of them political, some of them sore loser. You put whatever title you want on that one. So no matter what side of the political aisle you fall on, we can all agree that casting the ballot could use some improvement in general. So evolution of voting technology. So even though we've evolved over time, the physical tokens used in ancient Athenian democracy, those little slips of paper, balls, rocks, whatever, to mechanical voting machines, to punch cards, to optical scanners that we use now, especially here in Washington State, where we all vote by mail, the process of voting continues to be vexed with potential vulnerabilities and shortcomings. Right, and some of it has to do with signature authentication, and some of it has to do outside of technology, and there's a lot of other things. One of the biggest things on this one is hacking fears, and this is one thing that keeps on getting brought up, even though there's been no real thing with this, right? We always go through and we take a look at it, and again, if the cybersecurity guy for the 2020 election can say that this is the most safest and secure election ever, and that there were attempts to hack, then yes, this is a legitimate fear. But it's also an upside that we know about it, right? One of the reasons that we've been slow to migrate is that election integrity could be compromised by hackers. It's a rich target. It's one that would be great if you can skew the outcome of an election to your preferred or favored candidate. That's a huge win for you, right? So the fact that you can do this is an issue, and it's an upside that we know it, because we can integrate cryptology and software in a unique way to make sure that that is a tamper-free record. So there is a technology solution to this, and to making sure that the votes are accurately recorded. So now, the secure and immutable nature of blockchain says that the voter can actually go ahead and cast that on their computer or mobile device, and then go ahead and boom, there you are. For the military, what they've done is actually use a combination of biometrics to make sure the person voting is actually the person that they are. So they're taking a lot of lessons from online proctored exams, like from Person View or from PSINet. So as long as we're making sure that the vote is good and the person voting is actually the person that they say they are, and we can cryptographically sign that vote to make sure it hasn't been tampered with, the blockchain is perfect for this. Right, so we can get around some of that. Now, there's a lot of solutions here, right? Traditional cybersecurity assumes that perfection is possible, and that patches, firewalls, and antivirus solutions are sufficient to protect against increasingly complex attacks. The truth is that's not the case. Honestly, it's really not the case. Now, what's interesting, though, is that inside of some of the voting systems, there's the blockchain voting system, they were using a system called cast iron that leverages moving target database. So they actually were out on the cloud using Google Cloud Platform to make sure that the system security was in place and that they were doing a 0-day checkout. They were looking for supply chain attacks. They were looking for everything that could impact system performance. They were doing it at cloud scale, which is actually really kind of neat that Google Cloud was actually a big part of this process. So by running the Google Cloud program, they're taking advantage of the same secure by design infrastructure and protection that Google uses to protect your information, to protect the voting information, right? And their cloud infrastructure builds security through progressive layers that deliver true defense in depth. So it's a really neat way of marrying blockchain with cloud-based antivirus or anti-malware. So this cast iron system provided these following unique characteristics, right? They gave a distributed database that was fault tolerant, right? Immutability, they could not change the past. Once the block was in there, you can't go back and do it. Integrity, you cannot hack the present. So, and what they mean by that is that as long as those blocks passed validation and there was nothing hinky in there, they were considered with integrity. Data transparency, every node with access can see the results. So again, parent, child, hash, difficulty, and everything else is in there. Permission based, only those authenticated parties can have access. And that's good because then this becomes a private blockchain. And that's another big advantage to doing this in that way, is to have it as a private blockchain means you're not relying on the public to do the processing power. The only downside to that is that you need to make sure you have the processing power. The audit trail, every vote can be irrefutably traced to its source, in other words, back to its computer or back to its mobile device. And then anonymity. Ballots cannot be traced back to the voter. And that's another one where we're going to have to talk about it, because the paper ballot can be traced back to a particular voter indirectly. So there's ways of doing this. So yeah, for audit purposes, we would need to make sure that anonymity is with caveats. So as with any system, as with any change and any computer system, there are always going to be a way to hack it. But what makes blockchain voting so interesting is that we're running into the, is it worth the effort or is the effort too costly? So we're back to the 51% question, which is neat that there is a surface, but is the surface worth the effort to try to alter it? And then we can throw some other things in there to make it even more difficult. And even though we've seen some things in the 2020 election cycle and in the 2000 election cycle, there's a host of false data, fake electors, and other issues, including failed audits. None of that has to do with blockchain. All this stuff is social, right? So the election of blockchain voting needs to win that public trust first, but it's going to be hard to come by in an era of misinformation. So we're not looking at the underlying technology anymore. We're looking at all the things around it, right? We're looking at the false data. We're looking at fake electors. We're looking at failed audits across 5 different states that were unable to prove fraud. That doesn't mean that we're going to trust those electronic voting systems. It doesn't mean we're going to trust the blockchain. And again, this era of misinformation has really kind of twisted around how this would all work. Now, it creates fear. So fear, a large-scale manipulation of online votes, has kept back progress. And that really is a truism for me, right? You know, very few countries use online voting at all. And some just use electronic voting machines, EMVs, which require voters to go to a polling booth and show identification. So there are obvious advantages to using electronic voting machines. There's obvious advantages to using mail-in ballots like Washington State does and a bunch of other states do. It just all depends on where you are in the fear scale on this one. So again, it just boils down to how many democracies have not embraced online voting due to fears of hacking and fraud. Now, some countries have actively disused or actually discouraged the use of these, like the Netherlands. And, you know, Estonia, though, is the flip side of that. They've been able to successfully run its electronic elections, but they had a full paper trail backup. So Estonian citizens also cast their votes physically in a polling booth, and if they do, the paper ballot supersedes any electronic vote that they may have cast. So that's how we make sure that we don't double vote. So while we do have systems in place and there are checks and balances in place, yeah, we're going to have some fear here around that. And again, an era of misinformation. And with that, blockchain is supposed to make it harder to commit fraud. And that's a big one. The premise of blockchain technology is decentralizing the validation of information among multiple authorities. So as you've gone through and you've learned how blockchain worked, Essentially you either have a controller or you have a bunch of people that have agreed that this block is good, and there's no real reason to try to turn off your stake in that. So if they did this as a stake attempt, that would even be more interesting rather than a proof of work, right? So in a sense, every vote needs to pass the security of several validators in the network. It increases the cost, but decreases the likelihood of electoral fraud. And again, a large number of election stakeholders would need to work together for fraud to occur. And that's unlikely. It is really unlikely to have a cabal of people willing to do a thing at this level. It doesn't mean it can't happen, because we've seen that happen, but it doesn't mean that it makes it a little bit harder here. So when you're working with a permission system, the validators would be known to the voters. So we already kind of have that, especially here in Washington State, is that we know who our election people are, we know who our election overseer is, we know how a lot of this process works. There is no reason why the state can't assume this on the blockchain like they do with the mail-in voting. There's no reason why they can't. For example, party representatives from different parties, likely to have a low incentives to collude, would ensure trust in the system. That may be a little bit different given the era of disinformation that we live in right now. But it is to everyone's best advantage and everyone's advantage to have a fair and clear election, right? In addition, a blockchain-based system can allow independent vote monitoring bodies to audit the vote count, and it can do it on the fly. Make sure the system is free from fraud. And that's something that current centralized systems do not offer. Why we do have people that are watching the count, or we can go back and we can do it later. Blockchain can allow some really interesting data analysis on the fly to see if there's indications of fraud in the systems. Blockchains can also be incorporated into the voting architecture right from the start. And that will make sure that you get vote storage and vote counting all the way through the process. And again, as a private blockchain, this is probably the way to go. At each stage, they present a single agent for making changes without agreement. So again, we have our process. And again, I think more proof of stake is going to work here rather than proof of work. The downside of these additional security checks is the cost, right? And that's going to be running additional servers. But if you want to do this, then you're going to go. So there's some real interesting, good ideas for the favor of using electronic voting. Ideally, voters are going to gain a better voting experience. So you can sit on your sofa, you can be watching whatever it is you're watching on TV, binge watching your Netflix, and voting off your cell phone. Right? As long as you've passed all the checks, you can make sure that your vote will be correctly counted. You can make sure that it actually passed. You can make sure you're in the system and be able to vote more easily and efficiently. Right? Again, the whole idea is to make this as easy as possible. The government is potentially able to increase voter turnout and reduce costs and increase voter confidence and renew interest in the political system and voting. And again, the idea is to ensure the most democratic process possible. The goal here is to have everyone vote. With you're working with blockchain, the goal here is to have everyone vote, so that everyone can feel like they've had their voice at least acknowledged. It doesn't mean that was heard. It doesn't mean you won. It doesn't mean you get what you want. But you have the ability to influence what's going on. Doesn't mean that you'll do it. It just means that that potential is there. Electronic voting machines, users can submit their votes and be reasonably confident that their vote will count. All right. In other words, we're not going to be dealing with any hanging chads like we did in 2000. We're not going to be dealing with any of the other host of issues that have been self-inflicted in the 2020 election cycle. So we have some real ways of going through and making sure we can build some trust and some faith in these systems that we really desperately need right now. And then new electronic voting machines can also stop voters from common election faults, such as picking too many or no candidates, also thereby increasing the general effectiveness of voting, because there's some real user issues when it comes to actually voting interfaces and how those voting interfaces can influence how a person votes. There's some neat things that can be done here. So electronic voting via email also holds the possibility of increasing the ease of voting for citizens who are otherwise geographically isolated from election centers. Okay, so this is huge. Right, this really is. When we're talking about rural voters and we're talking about people that live like in towns of like 20 people, there may be one drop box, or there may be one drop box in a borough, and that borough may have, be spread out over 1,000 square miles, and it's really hard to get to that one drop box, right? Or it's really hard to get to that one spot. It's really hard for that mailman or mail person to come to your house and pick up your mail-in vote. So the idea of being able to open this up to more rural areas or areas that have a lesser population density is actually really good, because you're going to be geographically isolated from election centers. It's one thing to have one drop box in the middle of Dallas, because per zip code. That's one thing. When you have millions of people or hundreds of thousands of people that will try to use that drop box, and you're basically going to have someone sitting out there all day long, but that's a choice. But the idea of being able to use electronic voting for people who are in the rural areas probably will give them a better chance to have a voice and to vote into the system. So this is a big one. Potential increase in voter participation because of increased accessibility and decreased cost. Everyone's going to be on their cell phone or on their computer. And the decreased difficulty, makes benefits to a larger community. Maybe we can hear from some of these forgotten voices in the system, or people that don't believe that they're being heard. Right? Electronic voting also has the ability to reduce fraud by eliminating the opportunity for ballot tampering. All right. In the 2020 election, we did have people that were taking ballots and throwing them out into rivers and streams. Right? People were part of the mail system, were taking ballots and throwing them out. Paper ballots were having a problem, especially in some places, for signature checking, right? And things like that. So electronic voting has the ability to reduce fraud by really taking our lessons and examples from Pearson VUE and online proctored exams to make sure the person doing the test or doing the voting is actually the person that's supposed to be. Now, the cool part is that you can actually have paper ballots printed out as a backup for a recount, but the threat is always going to remain that something hinky happened along the way. But there are ways around it and ways of making it work. Some of the greatest features of electronic voting are maybe still to come, right? And software and mechanical functionality that would ensure accuracy, privacy, and verifiability. So there's still stuff coming. And again, this is still a technology that's in its infancy, and which would be kind of neat to see where it goes. Now, the downside of this, and we'll do a whole big, long presentation on that, is blockchain can't solve all possible types of election fraud. Right? If I get coerced into voting for somebody that I didn't really want to vote for, that's not blockchain's fault. It's not blockchain's issue. It's not blockchain's concern. Right? A network of authorized validators cannot check whether votes come from genuine users, but it can check for other key concerns. And there's a lot of statistical analysis that you can put on that to make sure that you do have genuine users. There are things that you can do in place to make sure you are dealing with genuine people and not bots. There's a lot of things that you can do to make sure the vote is technically valid and that no double accounting occurs and the vote comes from an authorized place. Now, Estonia, for example, voters can cast their votes from anywhere in the world using an identity card with a computer-readable microchip. Yet there's still no guarantee that that entry point that the computer the user votes from is free from malware. That malware could intercept that data and change it. There's no way to check that. Well, there's a way to check it, but again, as a big part of the process of how do we make sure this actually works. And that's where the challenge comes in, and that's why this is such a neat thing. There's a lot of places to go here, right? The benefits of a successful, secure, and transparent online voting system are clear, right? It would do away with a lot of the issues that we've got right now, especially things like artificial scarcity, capacity planning, one drop box per zip code, and a lot of the other things we're doing to try to restrict the vote, as long as there is a way to make sure the voter is an authentic person. Right? And now whether we're going to do some kind of blockchain digital ID to go along with that or some other way of ensuring ID systems, that becomes another problem that needs to be solved for this, but an interesting problem to solve as well. So we can do away with a lot of issues with postal ballots being delayed, waylaid, lost en route, thrown into a creek. We can do away with a lot of the issues that physical media has, right? From theft to fire to destruction. It would also reduce the time needed to count the votes. You can be running a statistical analysis of that blockchain on the fly, allowing for a much higher level of accessibility to the system and a higher enfranchisement process for the voter. Right? And finally, new and better voting rules can be implemented. Again, it's software. We can implement those voting rules in software. For example, referendums. Voters can securely delegate votes to more informed friends if they want to. So let's say the city of Seattle wants to do a referendum on the school system and they want to do a new bond. I don't have any kids. I don't have any kids in school. I don't care. So would I vote yes or no? I don't know. But maybe if I have a friend that does have a kid in the Seattle school system, I can just delegate that vote to them and say, hey, I'll have my vote the same way you vote. And that's possible because when you're sitting there voting in the middle of your house and you're voting with your family, your spouse and others, and you're all talking about, well, I'm going to vote for blah, blah, blah. Well, why? And then so on and so forth. You're gradually delegating that vote down to one consensus inside the house when you're voting. But there's no reason why you can't do that as a group of friends, right? And that's not necessarily collusion. That's not necessarily vote coercion. It depends on how it happens. And it's not necessarily vote buying. It's basically letting people that have more stake in the system have a bigger say, right? Especially if you have kids in school and you're doing a school referendum. I don't have kids. I'm not planning on it. It's not that big a deal to me. Right? It's also possible to develop voting rules that allow for multiple votes and incentivize more informed voters to use those votes. And that can be something that's interesting for union. That can be something that's interesting for a lot of other smaller votes that go along the way. The blockchain allows for a secure design of new voting rules, but this is fertile territory. There is no way that you can not have an idea here and not try to get it out into the real world and have some fun with it. So in summary, though, we're going to go into the full downside of all this in the next lecture. But there's some real upsides, right? There's some real promise to digital voting that can be done through the blockchain. But in the current environment of distrust, it's going to be hard. But that means that there's just this amazing opportunity to really do some good work in democracy, right? And do some good work in voting. As long as you can get people to trust the system you're building, like using blockchain, to making sure that there's authentication, authorization, confidentiality, all the things that we've come to expect from our voting systems, then you stand a real good chance of having a survivable and thrivable system here. There are already companies actively working in this area, but they're smaller. They're going to need some time to grow into full companies that can work at the national level political voting, right? You do have people like Dominion and others, but they're more of an electronic voting machine than a blockchain. So check and see where they're going. Maybe there's some work out of these systems you can do in blockchain. It'd be kind of cool to go work for these companies. The market, though, for other types of voting could be an excellent proving ground, right? So union voting, school elections, other non-critical voting opportunities to test your software. There's just some amazingly good places you could test where you want to go with this and make it actually work in a way that is beneficial to proving trust in the system. So again, lots of neat things that you can do here with digital voting, and it just all depends on where you want to go with it and how you want to approach it. But there's wide open opportunity and wide open potential on this, as long as you can build faith and trust in the system. And that will be the biggest hurdle to overcome. There's a bunch of other downsides that we'll talk about in the next lecture. So thank you for being with me, and thank you for listening to this lecture, and I will see you in the downsides to blockchain voting.